for inviting me here and for all the nice organisation. I hope I can do justice to this. I think it was quite some time ago that you approached the SGR office hoping that Stuart would come and talk to you. And Stuart lives in Lancaster, and so he delegated it to me. So I was all prepared to come to Faringdon, but here I am still in Bristol. Now I have some slides, so let's have a go at sharing. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Host, could you enable me, please?
Here we go. Let's see what we can do. Share advanced multiple participants. How about that? Does that work?
Let's have a go. Oh, yes. Right. So can you see a nice screen full of green slide? Yeah, I take that as a yes. Yes, thumbs up. Good, excellent. So oops. Oh, hold on. I'm very sorry. Hold on. I'm just going to. Sorry, I have an improved presentation. Hold on. I added an extra slide, and you're not seeing it there. So. Sorry, that was a false start. Right, now, let's try again. This will look remarkably similar. Right, there we are. The second slide is about me, which I missed out of the other one. So, yes, I'm a scientist turned engineer. My degree is from Cambridge University and my PhD was in steel microstructure. Even at that stage, I was having to make choices about who I wanted to have sponsoring my PhD. I decided I didn't want the Ministry of Defence because that was one option. Then when I left university as a metallurgist, it was quite difficult to avoid working in companies that do military work. But I ended up with NEI Parsons, who make steam turbine generators. So that's steam turbines for power stations. All seemed very, very good, all very peaceful, useful stuff for the general public. This was in the Northeast, heavy industry, which was contracting, and also in the 1980s, which this was, there was a growing recognition that there are some ways of producing electricity that are better than others. And steam turbines are used a lot in coal-fired power stations. So I got interested in wind energy and got a job at Nottingham University. I ended up as a lecturer there, and by the end of my time, I wasn't actually doing very much on wind turbines. So I took a year out, which I would recommend. I took a career break and did a master's, a one-year master's in renewable energy systems. And that enabled me to get the job in Bristol, which I did for 18 years at a wind energy consultant. So I sometimes give a talk called A Career in Large Rotating Machinery, because I went from steam turbines to wind turbines, and there's pictures at the bottom there of an onshore wind farm and then an offshore wind farm. And for the last 5 years, my main focus has been on the construction of offshore wind farms, which is quite an interesting challenge. So that's me. And alongside all this, I was involved in various organisations, one of them being SGR. So who are Scientists for Global Responsibility? Well, it's a membership organisation. It's been going for quite a long time. and it promotes responsible science and technology, as the name suggests. So it is actually a coming together of several organisations, and on the next slide I'll show you a kind of family tree. So the work it does varies a little bit according to who the members are at the time, but it's a mixture of detailed research work, education, careers, and advocacy interaction with the government. So one of the aspects is, and I think it was mentioned earlier, the campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. SGR were one of the many partners of ICANN which helped get the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty off the ground, and got the Nobel Prize. So this is the family tree. So some of you may have heard of some of the earlier organisations that have ended up within the SGR fold. So many of those organisations started in the Cold War. A lot had a focus on nuclear weapons. So they gradually came together, and SGR in its present form started in 1992. I think that's all I'll say there. So the main issues at the moment, if you go on the website, are security and disarmament, climate change and energy, who controls science and technology. So that covers things like sponsorship by the fossil fuels industry, by the military industry of educational events or research, or the professional institutions. So one thing that concerns me a bit is the heavy military sponsorship for the, I think it's called the Big Bang event. It's a science fair for youngsters, trying to get them interested in science and technology. But I'd rather it wasn't the military in the background. And then emerging technologies, so looking at both military technologies like drone warfare, but also civilian technologies like the ethics of cars without drivers. So we had a bit of a session on that. So we aim to challenge the power of vested interests, let's say. In earlier times, there was work on big pharma, chemicals and pesticides and GM crops. And one of the things not to forget is that it is a network for like-minded scientists and engineers. So it's good to get together with people who you know are on the same wavelength as you. Focusing in on the military project work, there's the work I'm going to talk about today, which is the carbon emissions of the military industry. Then there's also the other way around. There's what effects do climate change have on whether there's going to be conflict. I mean, we can already see that there are pressure points where resources and climate are causing conflicts. And then there's the emerging weapons side. On the right, now, I don't know how much detail you can see on your screens. This is a clip from the web page where one of the things SGR does is have comment pieces, blogs, and you can see the last couple that are appearing on the security and disarmament area. So one is SGR's response to government announcements on boosting military spending, cutting aid, and slightly increasing climate spending. And then there's SGR welcoming the ratification of the nuclear weapons prohibition. So the main topic of the talk here is based around this report on the right-hand side there, which is the environmental impacts of the UK military sector. Now, this was published this year in May, although Stuart, now that's a picture of Stuart Parkinson down in the corner there. He's the one of the main staff members at SGR. He did much of the research on this, and that is a picture there of Stuart. In the video, they did a video, just 3 minutes, giving a flavour of what the report is about. So the report was partly sponsored by Declassified UK. So you can find more information there. Anyway, Stuart was giving talks on this topic before the report came out as well. So how this work comes about is that there is a recognition and growing questions about quite what the carbon emissions are from the military sector in different countries. And in general, if you think what they do, you spend a lot of time trundling around in aircraft and marine vessels and tanks and so on. The main expectation is that they're responsible for quite large carbon emissions, but they aren't actually publicised or known how much they are. And in fact, the information that's available in this country is more than many other countries. So you don't get much from the MOD, but you get a lot more than other countries. So this report aims to get a more detailed and more quantified estimate of quite how big those carbon emissions are. So if we look at what main environmental impacts might be from the military sector and all they do, well, greenhouse gases will be the one that we would think about most and is easier to quantify. So greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide is the most important, and in terms of the military sector, most of those emissions will come from burning fossil fuels. So what's fueling the military vehicles. Also deforestation, which is a result of not just military warfare, but also some of the work that they're doing on training ranges and so on. So carbon dioxide is the most important, but there are other gases as well, like methane. And so the general way of measuring the emissions is in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you'll see this equivalent thing appearing when we're measuring, quantifying emissions. Then there are other environmental impacts. So it ranges from pollution at bases, the effect on wildlife. And then if we look at the military sector as a whole, it also includes nuclear weapons. And so hazardous waste from the nuclear weapons program is a big issue. This is, there is a section in the report about that. So what to do with all the nuclear powered submarines that there are. I think the UK has got more retired nuclear submarines than it has operational submarines, and it is a very long drawn out process to actually safely dispose of the waste, and this is yet to be done. And then if we think of this as a chain of possible environmental events, there is the use of weapons, and in particular what would happen if nuclear weapons were used. What would be the environmental consequence of that? So I'm going to focus on the things that we can measure more easily, and this is the carbon emissions, or the greenhouse gas emissions. So at the top there, we can split those into routine activities. So that's the operation of bases, the barracks, the heating of those, and the training grounds. Routine activities also includes vehicle use. So that's the second point down. So even when there isn't a war, there's a lot of use of fighting vehicles, aircraft, land vehicles, marine vessels. Then there's war fighting and war impacts. So looking down, there's a little bit more detail there. So we talked about the fuel use of vehicles and of the military bases. There's also the production of military equipment. So the raw materials, the supply chain and the final assembly, all that, if we think of the military industry in this country, there's a lot of emissions just due to the fact that we have all that going on. And then I've got the impacts of war itself. These are just some of the examples. So fires caused by weapons use, destruction of forests. And then after a war, there is the reconstruction. And as we know, the concrete and steel and all construction materials and activities involve a lot of carbon emissions. So that reconstruction activity does involve a lot. And then there's the other aspects of the impacts of war, the effects on the survivors. There's a picture there of the Queen Elizabeth, the new aircraft carrier. The MOD have just built 2 new aircraft carriers. So although in some areas we'll see that the carbon emissions have been dropping for various reasons in the military sector in the UK, with the deployment of these, I think it can only go up. Although I do have a little story about this vessel. In about 2005, something like that, I was at a wind energy conference in Glasgow, and to add a little variety and give us a different perspective on things, there was a speaker from the Ministry of Defence who was responsible for the design of these 2 new aircraft carriers, and he brought up a slide where he had a drawing of this vessel and it was all green, and he said, "This is the greenest aircraft carrier ever." Well, his audience were a bunch of wind energy engineers, and particularly 15 years ago, a lot of us were, like me, people who had specifically chosen to be in wind energy for reasons that we wanted to do good in the world. And so we were not wildly enthusiastic to have somebody from the military establishment there. And I think he was a little nonplussed at the sort of the lack of enthusiasm of some of the audience, because of course my immediate feeling was, well, whether it's a bit greener or not is really rather immaterial, since this vessel is cost huge amounts of money and its aim is to be part of the military weaponry of this country. So, but of course, looking at it from his point of view, the MOD person, he was part of the MOD. His mentality was to accept that we needed to have military forces, and his job was to design a vessel that performed as it should and was built to be efficient to run, and its fuel efficiency and its green credentials were all part of that. And so compared with other vessels, it was good. So it's all a question of perspective. Anyhow, I digress. Let us get, just to remind ourselves quite how much fossil fuel military vehicles do use. really it's a question of looking at how many gallons per mile they drink rather than how many miles per gallon they run. So they do use up a huge amount of fuel. And so we've got one mission of a F-35 fighter aircraft will use 28 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or emit that. Well, not quite sure what emission means, but if you compare that with the sort of average annual emissions for individuals in the world, well, the average is about 5 tons per person per year. For an American, it's about 16. For an EU citizen, it's about 7. So that just gives you a little bit of context. Right, so the Ministry of Defence, as I say, it does publish some results in its emissions and sustainability. In fact, like the majority of corporations, it produces a sustainability report as part of its annual report. What you see here is the front cover of the separate sustainable MOD report that they produced in 2018. In fact, in more recent annual reports, it is part of the main annual report. But for all the calculations that Stuart was doing to estimate, he actually used the data from 2018, which was the most complete he could find. So they talk about the MOD's contribution to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are quite wide-ranging, as you probably know. When it comes to the environmental impacts, they talk about, well, they split down the estates, which essentially are the military bases, training grounds, so that's UK and overseas. And then they have a category which they call capability and equipment, which is actually the military vehicles. They do report a number which goes to the government, who have a thing called the Greening Government Commitment, where each of the government departments in Whitehall have targets for reducing their emissions, their energy use and their power use and so on. And so for the purposes of that Greening Government Commitment, they only quote the estates number. They ignore the military vehicles use. Their justification for doing that is because the military equipment use is closely linked to operational tempo, and for this reason they are not covered by the Greening Government. So, in other words, performance and their military activities are the primary goal. Cost savings and sustainability come second to that. On the right there, that plot at the bottom, this is them showing that they have actually reduced the carbon emissions from the estates. The tall bar on the left is their baseline, which is 2010, and then the other 3 columns are the estates, energy and domestic travel for 2017, 18 and 19. So they've actually surpassed the target of 40% reduction. Part of that was really out of their hands because it comes from the fact that over that time, the UK has shut a lot of its coal-fired power stations. So any use of electricity that you make automatically has lower carbon emissions than it used to. But they have made savings as well. So anyway, let's delve a little further. Now, sustainability is not entirely ignored at the MOD. I want to just point out these 2 as well. The the magazine cover Sanctuary, that is the MOD's sustainability magazine, and they're up to issue number 49 now. So it's been going for some time. Really, it's talking about wildlife on their training grounds and archaeology and those sorts of things. I'm just reading quite what the contents of that one were. They had a fuel efficiencies project, which they talk about at Bryce Norton. They have a pretty abysmal record of low emission cars. They have a car fleet of about 7,000 vehicles, I calculate, and they've got 10 electric vehicles, but they're working towards getting more. So let's get a bit further into the numbers. We're working towards quite how big the total UK military footprint is. Well, in their report for 2018, the MOD give this figure 0.94 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's just for the estates. SGR, we added in the military equipment use, and the MOD do give some data on their fuel use by the equipment. They do put it in an appendix. We added that in, and so if you take that amount, the 3 million tonnes of CO2 in the year, that's about 0.7% of UK carbon emissions. And that little graph there, that comes from the UK Climate Change Committee. That's a colourful breakdown of where the UK's greenhouse gas emissions come from. And there's a tiny little, or there is a small segment at about 4 o'clock, which is military. But we do need to add in the carbon emissions that come from the military industry that we have in this country and the supply chain providing to the military. So what SGR did was to find out what the emissions were by the suppliers. They looked at the 25 leading corporations that manufacture military equipment to the UK military. And because of this trend now for corporations to publicise or publish their carbon emissions, data was available. Now, there was some rather peculiar variations in the numbers because I think they were counting different things, but this was the best data that we could get our hands on. So we took the declared emissions from those 25 military suppliers. Now, many of those are global companies, so we factored by the percentage of workforce that were in the UK. And then we also factored by the fact that some of their work was military and some was civilian. So that gave us a total emissions for these 25 companies. And then you take into account that there are actually other companies as well, smaller ones. And we do have numbers on the number of employees that are involved. So we could take another factor, just a factor up to catch all the companies. So the total from that is about 1.2 megatons. If you can see the screen, the top one there is BAE Systems, which leads by a long way in terms of their contribution to this carbon footprint. So they produce about a third of those 1.2. And to give you some context, that amount of greenhouse gas emissions is about similar to all domestic flights in the UK in a year. I think we need to say last year rather than this year. Okay, so we can add that 1.23 in. So we had our 3 from the direct use and the 1.23 from the suppliers. We also bear bear in mind that we have quite a lively arms export industry in this country, so they are also responsible for carbon emissions in the UK. And there will be some indirect employment, so people in offices and doing work that wouldn't be employed without there being a military industry. So add all that up and you get 6.46 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, which, if you compare with the total greenhouse gas emissions of the UK, it's about 1.4%. And actually, as an aside, when I was looking at this, I thought, well, we have all this data coming out. How do we know that they're using the same methods? And in fact, there is a UN protocol for how you measure greenhouse gas emissions, what you include and what you don't. So that's where the UK's number comes from. So at the top there, I said it's on a production basis. So we've looked at what the emissions are in the factories, at the military bases and so on. But we know from our own personal carbon footprints that we shouldn't just be counting the amount of gas that we use to heat our houses and petrol to drive our cars, but we also need to count the carbon emissions that come from us consuming products that were made somewhere else. So the typical example is goods that you've decided to buy that are made in China. And so somebody in China is using electricity from coal-fired power stations, and then fuel is being used to transport the objects to you here. So in the same way, for the military emissions, we need to include the extra bringing materials from abroad and the overseas supply chain. Now, don't worry, we're not going to do a long calculation about that. There's a different method for calculating that. This is called a consumption basis. And essentially, if you look at a high-level economic model, you can work out for the particular sector. And for this report, we used some work done by Lancaster University, I think it was. No, wait. And they estimated that for each pound spent, so pound sterling spent, that was equivalent to a certain amount of carbon dioxide emitted. So they just used a direct link that was established between overall carbon emissions to the spend. And so the question is, well, how much does the UK spend on the military? And this number, 45 billion, is one of the numbers that floats around. In fact, this is the number which the UK declared to NATO as to how much we spent on the military. So if you multiply up, you end up with a larger number than we had before, which is 11 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's sort of the end of our calculations, those who are getting a little weary of calculations. So this is the headline number, and it's equivalent to the annual carbon dioxide emissions of 6 million average UK cars. So that's a lot. And that is, if we calculate the greenhouse gas emissions on a consumption basis for the whole of the UK, that also is about 1.4%. So it's considerable. So that's just the UK. And as I say, we are fortunate that we are able to do some kind of calculation on it. There's quite a lot of uncertainties. But globally, it's very difficult to work out. There are few clear figures, and talking to Stuart, he estimates that worldwide, that about 5% of total greenhouse gas emissions come from military activities, both in peacetime, in routine activities, and also in the war fighting that they do. So the whole point of this work was to provide some kind of number, because it's not trivial, and it is part of the argument when we are doing calculations, or countries are working out strategies for what military capability they should have or not, what the implications are. If there are going to be targets, well, at the moment, targets to reduce carbon emissions are voluntary and virtually non-existent. Most countries, most military, Ministry of Defence in different countries exempt themselves from even thinking about it. And then, just as the final depressing thought is the effect if nuclear weapons are dropped. You get these huge clouds of smoke, which create nuclear winter. So it would have a huge effect on the climate. We know the effects of volcanoes erupting, what they have on the climate. Well, if there was nuclear war, it would be like multiple volcanoes. So at least we know a little bit better where we stand on the carbon emissions. And so how did this information, how was it received? Well, SGR got a lot of praise and accolades from peace campaigners about it. It's now being quoted by the Green Party, and there's a part of Extinction Rebellion called XR Peace. So they are linking climate and peace, and CND as well. There's also there's a select committee of the Parliament called the Environmental Audit Select Committee, and they had a sitting specifically into the MOD's carbon emissions, which was interesting. It was filmed, it was by Zoom, it wasn't that long ago. So there were people from the part of the UK military who were responsible for the infrastructure. The MOD splits itself into the operations people and the infrastructure. And so they were being asked questions about why the military is not doing more to reduce its carbon emissions. So one question, for instance, when they started talking about the electric vehicles, they were asked, well, it's not just the use of cars during your military duties, but where you've got military personnel living in barracks, do you make it easy for them to get to work without using their cars? Do you provide charging for them? So that if they have electric cars, they can actually charge them up? And it wasn't something they appeared to have thought about. And the last point I wanted to make there is that SGR are now writing a similar report for the European Parliament. So Stuart's busy working on that right now. So that will be useful. Would you like me to go straight on to the other areas, Stuart? Or can't hear you?
Sorry, I just needed to unmute myself there.
Yeah.
I think probably, Gillian, let's have some questions on the military bootprint, and then come back to these slides, if that's okay with you.
Yes. Shall I stop the slides then?
Yes.
And we can all see one another better.
And then we can all see each other. So if everyone would like to, by all means, unmute yourself, and I would suggest that if you go to the view, which is gallery view, so top right, you've got your option between speaker view and gallery view. then you can see what everyone is, if they put their hands up or if anyone wants to ask any questions. So go ahead. Nigel.
Yes, I think that was a wonderful talk, Gillian. Thank you very much indeed. Excuse me. I'm with Oxford CND and XRP, so I'm very interested about that, because obviously one of our main aspects is linking the military use of carbon use with climate change. But I wanted to ask you two things, please, if I may. One was about the American bases in Britain. Now, they all have RAF designations, such as Fairford, locally to us, and so on. I wondered if their figures were included in the MOD figures, because, for example, at Fairford, we recently had 6 B-52s there for a month doing daily exercises. There are U-2s there. And then in the East Anglian bases, there are many American planes. And I wondered about their emissions, whether the MOD include their figures. And the other question I wanted to ask was just about, excuse me, the work by the professor at Sussex University, looking at the MOD kind of almost discrete influence on the decisions at Hinkley Point, to build Hinkley Point, because they need a nuclear infrastructure to train their own apprentices. Now, that's a huge carbon emission project, all of that. And I wondered if that anything from that, any of their figures has been included. Thank you.
I wasn't involved in the detailed work here. As far as I'm aware, the figures that are appearing in SGR's report are really just based on what is found in MOD's own report, rather than trying to add in the things like Hinkley. I don't know the answer about the US bases in Britain. I think it probably depends whose jurisdiction they are. You'd have to really look into the detail, wouldn't you? When they're quoting that the MOD use so much fuel, well, it's going to be right down in the minutiae of the details, isn't it? As to who paid for the fuel, when, for which aircraft. So yeah. I'm sure they divide it up nicely, but I'm afraid I'm really just guessing. Yeah, go
just
on.
Because the MOD always like to say it's their responsibility of these bases, but you can't get any information about those bases, of course, when you really come down to it.
That's right. I suppose the question could also be the other way around, as to what happens when British planes are based overseas in other bases. So who's counting the fuel used there? So yes, that's an extra complication, and I'm sorry I can't answer, but I think really it comes into this large uncertainty that there is. In the report, there is a whole section at the back, at least a page, of comments from SGR on flaws and inconsistencies. So I don't know if any of those have been addressed. I think the Environmental Audit Committee have also picked up on some of the haziness that there is, so that at least the reporting is a bit more transparent and consistent. But those are very good points, Nigel, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dave.
This is not so much a question, it's just throwing into the mix a staggering statistic that I heard on the radio broadcast about 10 years ago, which is that 1/3 of the total cost of the US involvement in Afghanistan, 1/3 of the total cost was on air conditioning. So you can imagine how much carbon was released there.
Yeah. Yes.
Gillian, I did have a slightly similar question to Nigel's, actually, and perhaps I was also not expecting you to know the answer, but it's just really to throw it into the pot. And that is, we're very close to Fairford, and therefore every year we have the air tattoo, which we as the peace group, we know that it's actually just a front for the military arms sales that happen in the 2 days and the run up to the air tattoo. But we are looking at all of the marketing relating to the selling of tickets for the air tattoo. And they make a huge, great song and dance about the money that is raised for the RAF Benevolent Fund, which amounts to a total of about £500,000. And these are all your tickets that are raising all of this money. But again, just like Dave's little factoid from a moment ago, I read about 10 years ago that the amount of money, and so this isn't a carbon footprint, but it is related to the carbon footprint clearly, the amount of money that just the fuel costs for 1 day of the air tattoo is already more than £500,000. So again, the question begs itself, that must represent an unbelievable carbon footprint, which probably, again, isn't actually being measured because it doesn't really fall under the MOD as such. It's planes from all over the world that are actually going up into the skies. So, and it's arms manufacturers, for example, showing off their weapons systems and their aircraft. So again, it's just something to throw into the pot that this must be quite a significant carbon footprint. Any thoughts?
Well, included in the SGR analysis is the arms exporters footprint. So BAE Systems, when they're showing off what they're doing, I guess their balance sheet, their financial balance sheet will be including the money that they're spending on their sales. And so if you're linking expenditure with carbon footprint, then it kind of comes out a little bit there. When I was thinking it through as to what do the military do, how do they spend their fuel, I was thinking, does this include ferrying the royal family about? And what about search and rescue? Because they rescue people who fall down cliffs and things, or they used to. I think they still do sometimes. And part of it is counted as being part of their training. So they spend a lot of time training so that when they actually have to do things for real, they know how to do it straight away. But yes, it raises more questions than it answers. So.
Do we have other questions? Carrie?
I was just wondering if there was any analysis of, I mean, you've mostly talked about sort of peacetime carbon emissions, but in a war zone, how many times do the emissions jump up? I'm not talking about just the UK now, you know, manufacturing a bomb, but then actually exploding the bomb. So, you know, in places like Syria or Iraq, you know, is there any analysis of how much CO2 emissions there are actually during warfare, during active warfare, or is everyone too busy sorting out?
Well, at the end of the day, you'll be able to work out how much fuel you bought. So there'll be that aspect of it. The reconstruction side of things and the CO2 that's released in all the fires that are caused, because one thing that happens during warfare is that you bomb the fuel bases. You remember the pictures of huge palls of black smoke going up. Sometimes that's fuel bases. In the Middle East, it was actually bombing oil production. So it'll be very different according to which conflict it is. I'm not aware of sums that have been done. We tend to just write it down saying there will be this as well. But I can ask Stuart. I can see there's going to be a little list of things to ask Stuart, and see if there's anything concrete comes back from Stuart, then I'll let you know. So right, I've written that down. Sorry, I can't give you direct answers.
No, don't
Well, shall we ask Gillian to go back to the other slides that she's got relating to SGR?
Okay. Right, you should have another very green slide. Right, so yes, one area that we're working on at the moment is actually pointing the finger at scientists themselves. We did a survey and it was published earlier this year, last year, about scientists themselves walking the talk on climate. So how much do climate scientists actually fly and what difference does it make? And so on the right, there's just some graphs I've pulled out of where the scientists who agreed to do this, I was one of the ones, were asked what is your current behavior in terms of flying and car use. I've got the examples here. And what is your likely future behavior? So I don't know if they're going to do another survey in a few years' time to see if we've actually lived up to what we intended. So that was quite good. And one of the key points that comes out is that if you're a scientist talking about climate change, you are much more respected and believed if you actually walk the talk, if you do avoid flying where you can. And this has led on to a thing called the climate oath, where we're asking scientists, not just those working in climate, to actually sign up to something to say that they're going to reduce their carbon footprints. So I don't know if any of you have signed the quitting flying. I'm now in the position where I can sign up to that. The last long haul flight I made was in 2017 when I went to California. This was for work where I was running training for the people in the American government who are putting together the rules for offshore wind farms. And it was a training course where we had about 6 people presenting. Only 2 of us were present. So I was the European trainer and I had an American colleague there, and everybody else was coming in online. So I think of it as being a bit homeopathic, a little bit of bad, hopefully does a lot of good. So anyway, that's me. So that was one bit of work. Another one with a similar name, but actually a different aspect. This is called Irresponsible Science. Again, a report that was produced recently, investigating how much the professional organizations are financed by fossil fuel and arms companies. So looking at places like the Institute of Mechanical Engineers and a whole range. I think we looked at about 16 bodies, something like that. Whether they had strategies to reduce their investments in fossil fuels, whether they accepted sponsorship for their events from arms industries. Quite a few of the institutions now have sustainability committees and are running training courses and education for their members on different aspects of sustainability. And yet they still have investments. So we flagged this up and got quite a bit of interest. So having done the research from an objective point of view, the staff at SGR are now engaging further with the institutions to persuade them, try to persuade them that they might like to reduce their involvement. There is an area of work, this is actually a separate website, but it comes under SGR, which is activities. It's aimed at school pupils, and we do some activities directly with schools. But it's also for anybody. There are some very nice materials. So you can look up things like at the top there, these are food cards, and it tells you for different kinds of foods sort of what the water footprint is to make that food, what its carbon footprint is, and how much nutrition it has. So you can compare cheese and beef and chicken, and you've got different modes of transport as well, and other aspects of your your footprint on the planet, and look at ways that you might reduce it. And then there's ethical careers. This is materials that we are in the process of updating, but it's still quite relevant. So when I went to Cambridge to their ethical careers fair in February this year, and we got a lot of students coming along who were interested in what their options were. We have a series of papers just really fleshing out some of the dilemmas that there are and things that you might like to think about when you're choosing a career. Whether you want to go into a small company or a big company, or try to change a company from the inside if you don't quite agree with what it's doing. And I think this is my last proper slide. So this is how you can engage. So for free, you can download the publications, those schools resources, have a look at the blogs. You can sign up for emails, where we have news emails come out. If you become a member, then you can join the forums. And we do have an annual conference. Did anybody come? It was online. Well, it was actually a month ago, which is why I had to cancel my original date. I was going to speak to you. So I don't know if anybody did. But, I'm making these slides available to you in the PDF, and you'll be able to just click on it and it'll take you places. So that's me.
Well, Gillian, thank you ever so much. It's been extremely interesting and informative, and very clear too. We still have a few more minutes for any final questions, if anyone should have them. So please don't hesitate to ask. Pete, yeah, you're still on mute. There you go.
I was on mute.
Yeah.
I'm not knocking anything you've been talking about, but try to sort of bit of devil's advocate. If you had a blank sheet of paper, you talked about military 5 to 6 to 7%, and I'm not saying that's not important, because obviously it is. If you have a blank sheet of paper and you had all the scientists, which area would you tackle to give the maximum effect on the amount of greenhouse gases that are released?
Well, speaking as someone who doesn't think having a strong military is the way to have security, I would actually just reduce the amount of military hardware and activity that there was, and put efforts into building international security by other means, and that automatically will reduce the carbon footprint.
No, I appreciate that. Again, I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
But of all the carbon dioxide manufacturing methods, whether it be cars or whatever, or concrete and all the rest of it, which will give, as it were, the biggest bang for the buck and also reduce the carbon footprint?
Industry as a whole, you get through quite a lot of carbon emissions on concrete and steel. And as a metallurgist, I'm quite interested in the moves towards much cleaner steel making, so that you're not having to use carbon. So that's quite a long way back in the supply chain. It'll take a long time to filter through. But if you look at that aircraft carrier, there's a huge amount of steel in that, and a lot of tied-in carbon in producing that steel. So that's one of many areas that are being looked at. The reduction in carbon intensity of the power industry was really the easy thing to do. I mean, I've been fortunate to be part of that, working in offshore wind. But the bigger emitters in our society as a whole are concrete and steel and farming, and so I'm drifting away from your question about the military, but I think the biggest carbon emitters within the military footprint is just that huge use of fossil fuels to run all their vehicles. So I guess in the future there will be possibilities of running aircraft and land vehicles more directly off clean fuels. So there is work going on synthetic fuel and hydrogen and electric vehicles. It all assumes that you've got a clean form of electricity production as well. But some exciting things going on in the world of hydrogen. It'll take a long time or longer to filter through to the military than it will in the civilian population, because if you speak to a military person and say, how about using alternative fuels for your aircraft, biofuels or something, they will immediately respond, I will only do it if the performance is as good or better, because performance is their primary goal. Understandably.
Thank you.
You think where they're coming from.
Thank you very much.
But it is important that you have a low carbon footprint when you're killing people, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's one less person if you want to be very black about it all.
Yeah.
I mean, they tell us that if you have fewer children, then your carbon footprint is going to be less. But let's not go there with this conversation.
Yeah. Nigel.
I was just wondering if you could comment on, we've got a big university here in Oxford, of course, and it's the embedding of many of the scientists and their research into the military fabric, really. And we've recently made contact with a group called Disarm Oxford, who are students and lecturers and alumni of Oxford who are working to try and reduce the military influence in Oxford. And I wondered if you could comment on that as a scientist yourself.
Thinking of the military influence in general, one of the arguments for the military industry or military arms industry is that it employs a lot of people. Well, I think that's not really the case. So one of the areas that interests me is greening the economy, developing offshore wind, which does employ far more people. And so there is the transition going on for people working in oil and gas so that they can move across to greener technologies. There are also programs for people working in the military to get other jobs. Now, this isn't really because they want to reduce the number of people in the military, but it's more because at the end of their allotted time in the army, they usually sign up for a certain length of time, then the military provide them with a program so that they can go into civilian life. And many of them have very good skills in project management. So that's sort of swords into plowshares a bit. There are some good military tacticians now working in the offshore wind industry, project managing the huge construction projects. So I think the message really is that people with skills can be used in many different ways, and there are lots of sectors with good employment which needs to be expanded, rather than assuming that the military is where the top jobs are and the exciting engineering. So I'm not sure if that really addresses what you're thinking of, but
okay, thank you.
My feeling is that the military is not really quite as attractive as it was. when I was leaving university in the 80s and wanting a challenging metallurgy job, then quite a lot of those were in the military. But now my feeling is there's a much broader range of places that you can take your talent.
Do we have any final questions? Oh, Jenny. Oh, and Peter. Yeah. Jenny.
Jenny's on mute.
I think Peter was first, so he can go first.
Go ahead. Peter Gloines.
That's nice of you, thank you. I was just really trying to build a little bit on the point that Nigel Day made about this growing understanding of the link between civilian military power and military interest in nuclear. And the military interest in nuclear engineering is, as far as we can see, absolutely critical to the continued political will to have new nuclear power stations and subsidize that sector, and to accept the astronomical costs of nuclear power compared with wind energy or renewable sources. And one of the effects of that political bias towards the nuclear sector is that it takes away investment that could be directed towards renewable energy. And so I think that idea that hidden within the civil nuclear energy sector is a huge military contribution, really. And I just think it would be quite interesting if your group were able to make any sort of comments on that aspect of hidden military contribution to.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think there has been work. Phil Webber, who's the chair at SGR, he's very much more involved in nuclear weapons and also nuclear power. I think it is becoming more public that there is the link now, but it needs to be a lot more transparent. I live just down the road from Hinkley C, and I know people working on it. But yes, it does great rather when you see the economics of that compared with other parts of the power industry. So yes, I think you might find things on the SGR website on that link. I'll have a look myself and just confirm that it is definitely an area that needs bringing to the fore.
Sussex University.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jenny.
I'm not quite sure whether I'm asking a question or just making a point that I don't want to be forgotten. And perhaps Nigel could help me out with this. It's about the nuclear convoys that go up and down the country from Burfield to Scotland regularly. Nigel knows an awful lot about it, but I didn't want the carbon footprint, bootprint of that aspect of the military to be forgotten. Nigel, can you frame a question about that?
It's a big convoy. So it's a big convoy, maybe up to 25 vehicles. And one is actually on the move today. It's reached Yorkshire, and it will be coming through our part of the world tomorrow. So we as Newquatchers will be out there, and we tracked it last week going up, took photographs, went up the motorway, and on the motorway the sign said, "Stay at home, essential travel only." There was the convoy underneath this sign, travelling quite blithely up the road to Scotland. And that travels a number of times each year. It's small in the respect of that total thing. But that's one of the parts of the disregard by the military of any things to do with lockdown, anything to do with carbon footprint. They just do it regardless. So it's a very worrying thing, and it's carrying the deadliest cargo in the country on its way.
What's it actually taking then?
It's taking the nuclear warheads from Aldermouth, from Burfield, Atomic Weapons Establishment Burfield, where they put the weapons together. So they take the warheads to the submarines to Coalport, which is the store next to Faz Lane. So that travels with live warheads up and down the country. The MOD have said, should there be a fire, a certain accident, a certain way of an accident, there could be a plutonium emission. There wouldn't be an explosion, but there would be an emission of plutonium. So it's a very dangerous cargo that goes up about 8 times a year, up and back from Burfield to Coalport, and then it brings some of the warheads back for maintenance and because there's some the tritium is depleted, so some of them come back as depleted weapons and have to be disassembled and sent back again. They're all stored in Coalport in Scotland, nothing stored in England. But it's a very dangerous cargo that travels up, and I say it's on the road at this moment.
Yes, I have a friend who lives in Scotland, and when it came to the Scottish referendum, her reason for voting for independence was because they would no longer have the nuclear bases there. Regardless of any other aspects of it, independence meant that they would no longer have the nuclear submarines based there. So I'm not sure what would happen to where the submarines would go to, but that's another question.
Good question.
I think Plymouth has said that they would welcome them.
All right.
I heard, yeah.
Where?
Plymouth, I believe.
The only place they can go is in one of the estuaries down there. It's the deepest estuary where they plant the ships, but there's no nuclear place. There's no base. There's no place to store warheads. There is really nowhere for them to go, other than very embarrassingly asking the French or the Americans to park them.
Any final questions from anyone? Well, in that case, Gillian, thanks once again. And traditionally, we would at this point clap. So let's all take ourselves off mute. And thank you very much, Gillian.
Oh, thank you.
And then we ask people whether they want tea or coffee. So it's now your chance to try and get your own refreshment.
Your own.
There you go.
I'm on cold coffee.
Well, thanks again, everyone. And we'll make the link to the recording available to other Peace Group members who weren't able to attend this session.
Okay. How long do you make it available for?
Well, probably it'll be for the next month or so. Do you want to be sent the link, Gillian?
No, it's all right.
Good. All right.
I'm not used to my